The speaker today is Dr. Jory Weintraub, and he is the Science Communication Director at the Duke Initiative for Science and Society at Duke University. He is literally a science communication professional. He teaches science communication and runs all kinds of training for faculty. If you are interested after the webinar today in hiring Jory or learning more information about the offerings that he provides, please feel free to reach out to me and I will connect you so that you can get any of the training or anything that you're interested in. So thank you all for joining us today, and Jory, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. And just to be clear, when she says hiring, I already have a job. I have a couple actually. So, but
how about booking Jory?
Exactly. I do like to do these webinars whenever I can, and to sort of spread the gospel about science communication. But yeah, no, it's great to be here. I think I did science communication and broader impacts workshop for Arkansas EPSCoR a few years back. And that's how I first met Jennifer, and we sort of kept in touch. And so I'm really pleased to join you all today to talk about communicating science to policymakers. Just a little bit more background on myself. I'm a biologist by training. My PhD is actually in immunology. And then when I finished graduate school 20-something years ago, I promptly switched fields and stopped doing research in immunology and started focusing on science communication and science outreach and broader impacts. And in the last year, all of a sudden, all of the world is interested in immunology and the immune system. And I've been getting asked lots of questions about a lot of immunology that I have forgotten over the last 20 years. But it is kind of cool to hear everybody talking about things like herd immunity now. I mean, the context is unfortunate, but I am pleased that people are so interested in such a fascinating field. But I've really enjoyed this transition. I'm focusing my career mostly on science communication, science outreach. And that's what I teach now at Duke. And what we're going to be talking about today is one of the things I cover in my class, which is communicating your science and your research to policymakers. I'd like to encourage everybody to feel free to put questions in chat if you have them, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. And I will also hopefully have time at the end to answer as many questions as people have. All right, before I jump right into talking to policymakers about science, I thought it would be good if I maybe just spent a few minutes giving sort of a basic, what I call SciComm or Science Communication 101, just a quick review of some of the main principles that I try to cover as basic science communication concepts, just so we're all on the same page with that. And then we'll talk about how to apply those when meeting with science policy or with policymakers. You know, I'm going to spend the next 8 minutes covering a topic that I normally stretch out into an entire semester-long course. So this will be a very abbreviated version, but I think it would be helpful to just sort of quickly review some of the essential science communication concepts that apply in any context, including meeting with policymakers. All right, so the first one of these involves your message. And so in the science communication business, we talk about your message all the time. What is your message? And I like to compare the message, your science message or your research message, to a headline that you would see in a news article, you know, an online news article, or for the old folks like me, you remember the days of newspapers and you would skim the headlines to see what's happening. And, you know, I compare your message to the headline. It's the 5 or 6 or 7 words that sort of summarize your, you know, what you have to say and why it's important and why it's relevant and why people should care about it. So when thinking about what your message is, it's really important that you present it in a way that's easy to understand, that's memorable, that's focused, which can often be a real challenge for those of us in the science community, because we tend to often have a habit of going off on tangents and talking about all these collaborations and these related projects and these side projects, and we get very excited about all of these things. But when you're communicating, especially in a very concise format to a policymaker, for example, you want to stay really focused on the main message. And importantly, the message has to answer the question, why does this matter? Why should you care about this? it serves the same function as the headline, right? The headline is the short piece that tells you whether you want to bother to read the whole article or not. It tells you whether it's relevant to you and whether you want to dig deeper. And that's what your message should be when you're communicating your work, whether it's to policymakers or to the media or to the general public. So be very clear about what your message is, okay? The next thing you need to be clear on is who your audience is. Now, today we're talking specifically about communicating to an audience of policymakers and people that work with policymakers, such as staffers, right? But it's always important to know who your audience is so that you can frame your message for that audience. And what I mean by framing is that the message itself doesn't really change. The reason why your work or your research is important and adds value, that doesn't change regardless of who the audience is. But what does change is the context in which you deliver that message. And that's what I mean by framing. So for example, if you're going to talk to some policymakers about your work, then you may want to frame it in the context of, you know, how your research is relevant in terms of, you know, healthcare spending or, you know, policy that will affect climate change or whatever it is that you're working on. You want to put it in a context that's relevant to the policymakers and their constituents. You know, why should they care about this? How many tax dollars can they save the public by building policy around the research that you're doing or informed by the research that you're doing? Now, if you get invited, you know, by a third grade teacher to come into their classroom and talk about what you do as a scientist to a bunch of third graders, they're not going to care about policy implications or about tax dollars or healthcare policy. They just want to know what's cool, what's exciting, you know, what's relevant to them. So the message won't change, but the context in which you deliver it or the framing may vary from audience to audience. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well. Okay, jumping right through these. The next one, and this is important no matter who your audience is to do your best to avoid jargon, okay? Now, we talk about this all the time in science communication. And, you know, I always ask people, what is jargon? Define jargon for me. And the most common definition that I get is jargon is very technical, you know, very highly technical terms, names of molecules or retrotransposons or transcription factors, right? Things that most people have never even heard those words before. And that is certainly jargon. That is an example of jargon. But a really important point, and this is true particularly when you're meeting with people like policymakers, is that jargon can also be everyday language that's used in a discipline-specific context, okay? So let me give you an example of that, right? The word law, 3 little letters, couldn't be simpler, couldn't be more straightforward. But that word actually has very different meanings to different groups of people. So if I were to ask a scientist or an engineer, you know, what is a law? They would probably think of it in terms of, say, the third law of thermodynamics, right? And they would describe a law as something that is sort of a universally true, almost a rule, an unfixed or unchanging rule that's based on, you know, observations and collection of data and analysis of data to create this very rigid, fixed thing that's kind of applies no matter where you are, right? That might be how a scientist or engineer might define a law. Now, if you were to ask an attorney, what is a law? You would probably get a very, very different answer to that question, right? Oh, a law is, you know, it's essentially, it's a rule that we make up as a society because we think that society would function better if this rule that we made up and implemented were put into place, right? And you know, and it can change from city to city, from state to state. And you know, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the way attorneys use that term. To them, that is a more accurate definition. But it just underscores the point that the way you use the word, the context in which you use it, can vary from discipline to discipline. And so when you're thinking about the language that you're using, it's really important that you not only think about how you intend that for that word to be interpreted, but how your audience is used to thinking about that word, okay? So I think that that's another important element of thinking about jargon is everyday language used in a discipline specific way. And I have what I consider to be a fairly amusing illustration of the difference between jargon and everyday language or prose, right? You may recognize this. This is the opening line of Charles Dickens' classic novel, A Tale of Two Cities. And the opening line is, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," right? I've heard people refer to this as one of the great opening lines of any novel ever in the history of literature, right? So this is beautiful prose, right? What's the jargon version of this? The times were high variance, an analysis of cities with an N of 2, right? So, you look at this, and I always like to say, I have a son who's an aerospace engineer and a daughter who's in law school right now. And I always say, which one of these would you rather read? And I guarantee you that if I asked my son, he would say, oh, well, the second one is much more precise. I definitely like that one better. And my daughter would absolutely prefer the first one. So, different strokes for, but the point is we use language in different ways in different contexts, and you need to be aware of that and avoid jargon as much as you can. The next really important concept when you think about how to communicate your work, your research to people who are non-experts in your field, whether it's policymakers or a classroom full of third graders, is to deliver the information in the context of a story, okay? Now, as scientists, we're often trained, don't tell stories, present data, right? But what psychologists now know, behavioral psychologists and sociologists and people who study learning now know that when people absorb new information that's delivered in the context of a story, they actually show an increase in both comprehension and retention. And since those are jargony words, I'll say it differently, which is when you tell people new information in the context of a story, they understand it better and they remember it longer. So, deliver the information in the context of a story, a really important step in helping people engage with the information you're giving. And we actually know a lot about the biology and the physiology of this now. We know that when people hear new information in the context of a story, as opposed to, say, just presenting it as a graph or a chart or a list of data points, it does several things inside of our bodies, inside of our brains. It increases the production of something called cortisol, which has the effect of focusing our attention and making us pay closer attention. This is one of the fight or flight hormones. And so, it focuses attention and makes you pay attention to what's going on better. It increases the production of something called oxytocin, which is a compound that's known to be elevated in mothers that have just given birth, for example, and is considered to be an empathy booster. So it makes people care more about what's happening around them and feel more empathy. Storytelling also increases dopamine, which is known to increase memory, and increases neural coupling, which means that we're making new connections in the brain. And so for all of these reasons, we know that delivering new information in the context of a story is a much more engaging way to communicate your information, and it's going to lead to your audience understanding what you're saying better and remembering what you're saying for a longer amount of time. So storytelling is really key as well. And then the last point is to be definitive, okay? And this is really important as well, because as a scientist, I can tell you that a lot of us get training in our communication in ways that encourage us to be a little bit cautious about how we present information, to equivocate, or in a more colloquial term, to waffle a little bit, and not make a definitive statement. So, for example, a scientist might say something like, well, we think our data are suggestive of the fact that there is a correlation between this and that, and we think that this correlation, it may be significant, but we're going to repeat multiple trials with a larger sample size and do some different statistical analyses to try to really determine if this is significant or not. Okay, so that's a very scientific, sciencey way of giving an answer, right? the public hates that, right? They don't want to hear all that equivocation, all that waffling. They just want to know yes or no, So should I wear a mask when I'm out in public or not? Is it safer for me? Is it safer for the public, right? So to the extent that you can be definitive and you can give a yes or no answer, you should always try to do that. Now, we don't always know the exact answer. We don't always have a yes or no answer. And a perfectly acceptable answer can be, that's a great question. We're not sure. We're looking into that. Or, we think probably yes, but we'll know better after we finish this round of experiments, right? So you don't want to make things up, but you also, you want to avoid being, you want to avoid waffling and equivocating as much as possible. So to the extent that you can be definitive, that's received much better by a non-expert audience. People are looking to you to be the expert. And as an expert, they want to hear as much as possible, yes or no. All right, so again, that was my entire semester-long SciComm course in 8 minutes and 5 slides, right? I want to make one more point before we sort of transition to talking about policymakers, which is, even if you do all of this stuff as well as possible and you communicate as effectively as possible, you're still going to encounter something called confirmation bias, which means that every human being has this tendency to be selective about what they do with new information, right? We have a tendency to take in or accept information which supports the ideas and the notions that we already have in our head. Those things which we, the preconceived notions, which we are inclined to believe, right? And at the same time, we can be really good at filtering out or ignoring or not even hearing those data, those results, that information, which seems to contradict our predisposed notion of what is true and what's not. And so no matter how effectively you try to communicate, you still need to remember that your audience, whether it's a policymaker or someone in the media or a classroom full of third graders, they're all going to have these confirmation biases. And that doesn't mean you don't try to communicate effectively. You should still try to do it as effectively as possible, but you need to understand that these biases are going to be in place, and it's always going to be a bit of a challenge. But I think the more you can try to adhere to these sort of tried and true good communication practices, the more effective you'll be at getting through to your audience. Okay, so let's transition a little bit to talking specifically about science policy and talking to policymakers, okay? So this is sort of your standard definition of what science policy is. We all, have heard definitions and have a good sense of what science policy is. But when people talk about science policy, it's important to realize that often it's broken down into sort of a yin and yang, sort of two sides of the same coin. And that's often referred to as policy for science versus science for policy, okay? And what I mean by that is, by policy for science, I mean what policies shape or affect the way we do science, the way we practice science. Okay, that's what we mean by policy for science. How does policy affect the doing of science? And then the yang to that yin, the flip side of that, is science for policy, which is, how does science inform policy, right? We would all like to think that policies are shaped and informed by, sound science. I think we've seen, especially in the last year or so, we've seen many examples where often policy, unfortunately, is not informed by science. But in an ideal world, policy is based on, at least in part, on what we know about something based on scientific research. But that's what we mean by this sort of dichotomy of policy for science versus science for policy. And so these two things, again, inform each other. It's sort of a feedback loop where they feed back on each other. And to give you a specific example of this, in the first case, how policies shape science, I mean, the EPSCoR program is a perfect example of that, right? The EPSCoR program was created as an active science policy, and it's a way of allowing people to do science and engineering work, right? So that's a policy that promotes or supports good science. To take a step back, as a more general statement, any policies which affect funding decisions or funding priorities are examples of policy shaping science. It could also be things like policies that mandate public engagement. For example, the National Science Foundation's broader impacts criterion, which mandates that in addition to doing research, right, you also have to communicate to the public the relevance of and the value of the research that you're doing. Policies that create or support training programs for graduate students, for postdocs, programs that create or support or fund diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and even things that seem mundane but are actually, crucial to people's lives, such as how much a stipend, a graduate stipend, or a postdoc salary might be. These are all examples of policies that shape science and the way science is done. Again, the flip side to that is science for policy, or how does science shape or inform policy? And the best examples of that would be things like laws and regulations and standards pertaining to things like air quality, water quality, usage of pesticides, food processing and handling, drug and pharmaceutical usage, all of the press that we've heard over the last year about, the FDA making vaccines available to people. These are all things where the science that we know is shaping the policies that are in place that affect our lives every day. So, again, when you think about science policy, you need to think about that duality, or that sort of yin and yang of how science shapes policy and how, conversely, policy shapes science. Okay, so to transition a little bit more, who makes policy? Where does science policy come from? Who makes policy and who influences it? Well, it's not a quick and easy answer. There's actually, it's a pretty messy answer. And this is actually a simplified version of it. But this gives you a little bit of a sense of how complex it actually is, right? So there's a lot of groups, a lot of audiences, a lot of players involved in actually shaping policy. When I pose this question to my students, who makes science policy, generally the answer I get is, well, the president and Congress. And certainly the president and Congress are involved. But as you can see, that there are many, many, many other players that are involved in this conversation, right? So, government officials outside of Congress and the White House and the Oval Office, all the department heads and the cabinet, the people who hold cabinet positions, the private sector, all the lobbying that goes on, and pollsters and everyday citizens like you and me. The media certainly plays a role in influencing the policy agenda, and then the list goes on and on. There's foreign influences, there's non-governmental influences like think tanks and those of us who work in academia and try to contribute to the narrative about policy, the intelligence community. So there's a lot of people involved. It's not a simple process at all. But this gives you a general sense. But when people say, well, Congress and the president, ultimately the policies generally are created and enacted and enforced at that level, but all of these other players are involved. But given the important role of Congress in creating and shaping and driving science policy, I think it's interesting to note historically how relatively scarce scientists have been in Congress. This is information on the 115th Congress, and that was the Congress, not the current one that we just swore in this January, and not the one that was present for 2 years before that, but the Congress that was sworn in January of 2017. So right after President Trump was elected, this is the makeup of the Congress that came in when Trump came into the to the White House. And what you can see is that there were very few scientists who were members of Congress at that point, right? There's not surprisingly at all, there were a lot of lawyers represented. There were, quite a few physicians, but when you come down to scientists, there was a single physicist, a single chemist, and a single microbiologist. There were a handful of engineers, but interestingly, my students always comment on this. There were twice as many almond farm owners as there were physicists or chemists or microbiologists. I'm originally from California, and I have a little bit of insight into why there were two almond farm owners, and it has to do with the fact that almond farming, which is big in the Central Valley in California, happens to be an extraordinarily water-intensive process. And in California, water is power and power is water. And so, it's not surprising that almond farm owners wanted to have a political seat, because water policy is a huge thing there. Just a bit of a tangent, but my students always wonder, why two almond farmers and one physicist? Now, what happened when the Trump administration took over was that fairly quickly there were a number of policies that were enacted that were not only not based on science, but actually were contrary to what the scientific consensus was. There were a number of anti-science executive actions and things put into place. And that's when we had the first March for Science. And there was this sort of galvanizing effect where scientists and supporters of science really sort of came together and said, we need science to be informing policy. We want our policies informed by what we know about science. And what that led to was, in the midterm election, which happened 2 years later, there was this massive increase in the numbers of scientists who decided that they wanted to actually run for office and become policymakers. And there was the creation of something, a political action committee called 314 Action. 314, of course, being the first three digits of pi, 3.14, which is where they got the name from. And this was basically a political action committee, or a PAC, that was assembled to promote and support scientists running for office. And this was all really driven by this desire to see a greater level of scientifically informed policy making. And actually, it was fairly successful, because during the midterm election, more than half of the scientists who ran actually were elected, and the number of scientists in Congress increased dramatically. From 3 to in the teens at least, which was a pretty big jump at that point. So this was kind of a big deal, right? And this really represented the scientific community getting more directly hands-on involved with making of science policy. But it's important to realize that if you're a scientist, you can be actively involved in driving policy discussion without taking the fairly dramatic step of running for office and becoming a congressperson, right? So there are other ways, many other ways, for scientists to be involved in the policy conversation, okay? What are some of those ways? Well, as a scientist, you can do this through writing. You can write articles for popular audiences, and commentaries and op-eds. So the written word can be a very powerful way to influence people, right? You can do it through speaking, by giving public presentations, and doing media interviews to inform the public of science and how it should be informing policy. You can do it by engaging with the public in other ways, through social media, or giving testimony in courtrooms and in congressional hearings to share your knowledge of science that way. And last but not least, you can actually, as a scientist, meet with policymakers directly and have conversations with them about your science and why you think that policy should be informed by the science that you do, okay? So a lot of ways that scientists can get involved, okay? But again, you may ask the question, well, why? Scientists are busy, right? We're writing grants, we're writing papers, we're teaching courses, we're training graduate students, we're going to conferences. On top of all of that, we're trying to run a lab and do our research, right? We got a lot of things on our plate, and you also want us to get involved with science policy. Well, nobody can be forced to do that, but it turns out that actually when Abraham Lincoln chartered the US National Academies of Sciences, Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 1863, it was actually written into the charter of the National Academies of Science that scientists in this country, there is an expectation that when they're called upon, they will contribute to the betterment of our country and of our society through sharing their knowledge and their insights and understanding of science. So at that level, it's actually codified. It's written into the charter of the National Academies of Science. But to give some more accessible, I think, arguments for why scientists should consider meeting with policymakers, it's an excellent way to advocate for science-based policies. It's an excellent way to advocate for increased funding or maybe reallocated funding of science. And finally, it provides a diversity of perspectives, right? If people are making decisions about science policy, we want as many diverse, informed perspectives as we can being a part of those discussions. So there are a lot of really compelling reasons why we want to think about, as scientists, why we want to think about engaging in conversations with policymakers. Those are sort of my arguments for why we would want to do that. Now, just to clarify, I've already sort of touched on this, but just to make it really clear, again, scientists can engage directly with the media by doing interviews. Here's Francis Collins of the NIH being interviewed on CNN. But it's important to understand that when scientists engage through the media, generally what their role is to inform or explain, right? Now, there's no doubt, especially as things become more politicized and more polarized and more highly charged, there's no doubt that scientists appearing in the media doing interviews may also be advocating or promoting for particular policies. But at least in theory, when scientists do media interviews, it's largely to inform or explain, okay? However, when scientists get involved in the policymaking realm, it's because while they still want to inform and explain, they also want to compel or to advocate or advocate for or to persuade the policymakers to behave or act a certain way, right? So it sort of goes a step beyond simply informing or explaining. And in this picture, you can see Jim Hansen, who was a scientist at NASA, whose testimony before the Senate in 1988 is considered one of the pivotal moments in really ratcheting up the dialogue around climate change. And so, in this case, he wasn't just there to inform people about the risks and the threats of climate change, but to actually advocate for enacting policies that could do something about that. So important to make that distinction between your goal being to inform or explain, or to take it a step further and actually to advocate for certain policies or to try to persuade people to enact certain policies. Okay, so that's kind of some background on sort of sound science communication principles, and then a little bit of a civics lesson on the role that scientists can play in being involved in the conversations about science policy. What I want to do for the last stretch here is really shift to more of a nuts and bolts conversation about what actually happens when scientists meet with policymakers. And we'll go through several aspects of this. So we'll start with things to anticipate, and then how do you prepare for it, what to expect before it happens, and then what to expect during the actual conversation or meeting, and then ways to follow up. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about what to leave in their hands when you walk out of their office. Okay, so to start with, what can you anticipate? You're a scientist or an engineer, you get the opportunity to go to the State House or maybe go to DC and meet up on the Hill with some policymakers. Here's some things to anticipate. Number one, schedules change constantly, right? You just need to be aware that there's several possibilities that might seem less than ideal, but are very possible and might happen. One is that you may get way less time with the the congressperson or their staffers than you were actually promised. You might only be promised 5 minutes with them. That's actually, they chunk their schedules out in 5-minute blocks of time. I saw a great, I couldn't find it for this presentation, but at one time saw a great, it was a picture of a page out of President Obama's daily calendar. And it was broken down into 3-minute and 5-minute chunks, 3 minutes with this person, 2 minutes to walk down the hall, 5 minutes with this person. And this is sometimes hard for scientists to wrap our heads around, because we work on scientist time. And what I mean by scientist time is, we spend 4 years as an undergrad and then 5 or 6 or 7 years in grad school studying something. And then we do 1 or 2 postdocs for 2 or 3 years each. And then we become a faculty member, and we spend, years sort of learning more about what we do. And we, start thinking about grants, and we may percolate on a grant idea for months or years before we actually sit down to write the grant. And then the grant writing may take a year or more. And then we submit the grant, and it may be 8 months, 9 months, a year before we even find out if we're funded. And then once the money comes in, right, then, another few months before we start collecting data, and then we'll do that for a couple of years, do some analyses. Maybe a year or 2 down the road, we write a couple papers. I mean, this is the time frame we're used to thinking of as scientists. With the media and with policymakers, it's 3 minutes at a time, right? That's the time frame that they're used to. So, you might get promised only 5 minutes with a staffer and a congressperson, and then it might turn out that you might end up only talking to them for 2 or 3 minutes. It might be canceled entirely. If you do get that time, you should anticipate that it's very likely that the congressperson or the policymaker may be interrupted multiple times during your 5-minute conversation by a staffer walking into the office and handing them a slip of paper and whispering something into their ear. And it, at the end of the day, it might turn out that you don't meet with the congressperson at all. You only end up meeting with their staffers. So all of these things are possibilities, and they can all be frustrating. But one thing I want to say is, to the last bullet point about you might only end up meeting with the staffers. If that happens to you, I don't want you to think that it's a total loss or it's a waste. In fact, most of the time, we saw the numbers earlier about how many policymakers, how many congresspeople are actually trained in science, right? Most of the time, the congressperson will not have a deep background in science. And it's one of their staffers who has more scientific expertise and actually may be in a better position to understand what you're saying about the science. And then they have the relationship where they can translate that information and communicate that to their boss, to the policymaker. Now, to be clear, you may be asked to be the scientific expert of the staff because you have an undergraduate degree in geology, and I mean, I'm not talking about necessarily a staff of 12 PhDs. I'm talking about someone who has a bachelor's degree, but sometimes, and not to belittle a bachelor's degree in any way, but sometimes that's the extent of their science background, but that still may be significantly more science background than the congressperson has, and it's generally enough that staffer should at least have a general sense of why what you're talking about is important to them. Having said that, it's more important than ever for you to understand that you need to be able to communicate what you do in a way that they can understand why it's relevant and important, even if their science background is limited to a bachelor's degree in geoscience, and you're there to talk about something having to do with biology or engineering, outside of their scientific training. So anyway, these are all just things to anticipate before you ever even get to the point of sitting down with the policymaker. All right, so the next thing is, what to do. You've gotten this opportunity now. You've gotten the chance to go up to DC or go to your state house and meet with some policymakers. What do you do in advance of that to prepare? How do you prepare yourself to make the most of your 5 or 10 minutes or however much time you get? Okay, well, The first thing to know is that if you're at an academic institution or a research institute, or probably even large corporations, but certainly I don't know that world as much because I've always been in academia, but certainly within academia and within research institutions, there will be at least a person, if not an office, a whole office at your institution specifically designated as a government relations office, right? They are the experts at your institution. They're the ones who are sort of the permanent full-time liaisons between your academic institution or scientific institution and Capitol Hill or the State House, right? So you should absolutely find those people at your institution and reach out to them. Now, a lot of times the way you've gotten this opportunity to meet with policymakers may be because the government relations office contacted you initially. And so in that case, obviously you're already in conversation with them. But if you get an opportunity and it's not sort of negotiated or mediated through your government relations office, you should absolutely start there and reach out to them and say, look, I'm a postdoc, I'm a grad student, I'm a faculty member. I have this opportunity to go talk to a policymaker. Can you help me prepare? And what they will do, because they're the experts on this, is they will talk you through how to prepare. They'll tell you what to expect. There's a good chance that they know, they have a personal connection with the policymaker and or members of their staff. They can give you insight like, okay, this person really likes it when you do this, but they hate it when you do that. They will go, they will drill with you and they'll go through practices of what you're going to say, and they'll give you feedback on it. It's absolutely essential, and it can really make a huge difference. The other thing that they will do is they'll help you craft your message, right? So going back to what I said earlier about message, they'll help you figure out what is your message and are you framing it the right way for this audience? And they'll help you determine things like, is it an ask? Are you asking them for something specific, for appropriation of money or creation of a certain policy? Or are you there primarily to lend your expertise and to explain what your work's about, why it's fundable, why it's relevant to them or importantly, their constituents, right? So your government relations office can help you do all of these things. The other thing that you need to do when you're getting ready to go talk to policymakers is you need to prepare a one-pager, or what I often call a leave behind. And this is because you're gonna, like I said, you're gonna get maybe only 5 minutes, 8 minutes with the person. You might not even get that if it gets canceled. And there's only so much you can say in that amount of time. But if you want to leave something in their hand, a one-pager that summarizes your main message and has, in a very accessible way, and we'll look more at that in just a couple minutes, and gives your contact info so that they can follow up with you if they have additional questions, right? They will possibly be meeting with 20 or 30 different people or groups throughout a single day. And so they're not going to remember everything they hear. So this leave behind is absolutely essential. And it's your chance to reiterate and reinforce your message and the main points. And then the last thing that you want to do, obviously, before you go to the meeting is to practice and to be, right on top of it and to be ready and well drilled so that you don't get in there and lose your train of thought or get flustered. And, for a lot of people, it can end up being a kind of an intimidating or maybe overwhelming process, especially if it's your first time on the Hill, the first time, in the chambers of Congress or in one of the office buildings, and all of a sudden you find yourself sitting, 5-10 feet from someone who you've only ever seen on TV. It can be a kind of an intimidating process. So you want to be really well rehearsed and practiced and be able to jump right in and have a good, engaging conversation without getting flustered or nervous about it. All right, so that's the before. Let's talk a little bit about the during, what to expect during the actual meeting, okay? Well, like any other meeting, it's going to start with introductions, but the introductions here are really important, right? Because you're not going to get a lot of time. And so in your introduction, you want to establish your credentials right away, right? You want to let them know who you are and why and how you're an expert on this topic. so that they know who they're talking to and they take you seriously, right? So in your introductions, make sure you make it clear not only where you're from, what your name is, but what your background is, what your expertise is, what are your credentials to be meeting with them, to be advocating for a specific policy or talking about a specific science message or concept. And then all of these things I started out with today, these sort of best practices for effective communication. Deliver your message clearly, deliver it concisely, and right up front. There's an acronym that's often used in government and in the military. It's BLUF, B-L-U-F, bottom line up front. First things out of your mouth after the introduction should be, what is my message? Why does it matter? Why should you care? That's you want that to be right up front when you start speaking. Think about the framing. We talked about how important it is to make your message relevant, not just to them, but probably more importantly, to their constituents. So when you talk about things, put it in the context of, this is how this will benefit your constituents, because ultimately they are there to represent their constituents. Idealistically and cynically, they are counting on their constituents to re-elect them. And so for both of those reasons, you want to frame things in a way that makes it very clear how it's relevant to their constituents. Concise, short sentences, minimal jargon, and then coming back to this idea of storytelling, right? We've all seen over and over, we've seen politicians on the stump, on the campaign trail, and we've heard them say things like, I remember last week when I was in Dubuque, Iowa, and I met a single mother who was raising 3 kids and had to work, double shifts at the factory and then evenings, in a coffee shop, waiting on tables to be able to put her 3 kids through school and pay for their medical bills. And this is something that you hear politicians do all the time. It's an anecdote, right? In science, we're often trained not to use anecdotes, but to speak about data in the aggregate, right? Let the data speak for themselves. When it comes to engaging with policymakers, their world is anecdotes. They thrive on these individual stories. So as you're talking about your science, put it in the context of a story, and don't be afraid to give an example of a specific person, or a specific group of people who are being affected by rising tides and climate change, right? It's those stories that they internalize and take with them when they're going to subsequently make their arguments for the policy that you want them to advocate for. So tell a story, make it personal, use metaphors when you can. If you can give them a powerful statistic that really illustrates the point, that's very effective. Dramatic stories about the struggling single mom who's working 3 jobs, right? Those are the things that really get your point across. Additional things to think about, we talked about the importance of not waffling or equivocating, but as much as possible, being definitive when they ask you questions. Do your best to give a definitive scientific answer. But at the same time, you don't always know. And remember, it's okay to say, great question, we don't know yet, we're looking into it, we'll get back to you when we have those answers. You don't ever want to ignore or downplay the limitations of the science or what we don't know yet. And a lot of times the part about not knowing something yet is a very compelling reason for why they should consider increasing funding for that type of research. So it's actually okay to say, that's a great question. If we had the funding, we could be answering that question right now. And then another thing that often scientists aren't prepared for and aren't often asked to do in a scientific context is to give their own opinion, right? Again, we are trained as scientists to speak about the data and envision that the data will speak for themselves, right? We're not often asked, well, what do you think we should do? But that's very likely to happen when you're meeting with a policymaker. So be prepared to give your opinion, right? Even if it's not something that you had been thinking about previously, they're looking to you to be the expert. So when they say, well, what do you think we should do? Don't be afraid to give your opinion, but an opinion which is based upon or built upon a foundation of the science that you know. And then just as important as the speaking is listening, right? You have to give them an opportunity. They're politicians after all, so give them an opportunity to talk about themselves and about their constituents, and and it's important to listen as much as speak. And then lastly, don't forget the one pager. All right, afterwards, just very quickly, some things to know when you follow up. Sorry about that. If there's going to be follow-up, do it immediately afterwards, right? Because again, remember politician time, policymaker time versus scientific time. So, follow up promptly. If there was anything that you promised to get them during the meeting, if they asked for some information on something and you didn't have it right at your fingertips, say, we don't have that information right now. We'll be happy to get you that information. Follow up immediately with them and their staffers. Any follow-up conversations that you're going to have back at your institution or campus, make sure you do those as soon as possible as well. And consider, reaching out to that government relations office at your institution and having a sort of a post-mortem discussion with them. There's a chance that someone from that office will have gone with you and will have been in the office. And then you may have the post-mortem, on the plane flight or the train ride back to your institution. But if you weren't with someone from that office, then as quickly as possible, while things are still fresh in your mind, set up a meeting so you can sit down with them, do sort of a brain dump, say, this is what we discussed, this is what they said, this is what I said, and get their feedback so that the next time you get the opportunity to do this, you'll be able to benefit from that feedback as well. Okay, and now the last couple slides I want to finish up with are about this one pager or this leave behind. Now, this is not a policy brief. It's not a policy memo. If you've seen those before, those are, all text documents. It looks like a monograph or a scientific paper or something. It's all text. There's no illustrations. It's not visually appealing. It's just a very standard format, a policy brief or a policy memo. A policy one pager or leave behind, think of it more as an infographic, right? It's very concise. It's meant to convey information in a more engaging way. There's going to be an image or a graphic, at least one, if not a couple. There's going to be, as you can see here, a column with some bullet points or key issues for them to remember. Importantly, your contact info has to be on there somewhere. But concise wins the day, right? So single page, not front and back, just front, large font, wide margins, lots of white space, visually appealing colors. If you're coming from a university, you can do it in your university's colors if you want. Bold title in big font so that they can see what it's all about. A one-sentence summary or a very brief abstract. Again, visuals and infographics. Keep the text to a minimum if you can. And then very importantly, what is your ask or what are your action items or talking points? And what's your contact info so that they can follow up with you if they have more questions, okay? Now this example here, I don't even consider a great example. I think this is an okay one, but to me, that's very texty. And the next slide, I wanna show you one that I think actually is even better, right? Notice brighter colors, less text, more graphics, visually appealing, right? So this is what you're going for with the one pager. And finally, the language is very important. The language that you use. You want to be diplomatic, not aggressive or zealous, or overly persuasive with what you're saying. So for example, you want to use softer language like threaten or increase the risk of or negatively impact, as opposed to saying things like this will destroy the environment or this will ruin the climate or this will devastate our economy, right? These very sort of foreboding, definitive statements, you want to avoid those if possible. You want to use words like we will improve or we will enhance, as opposed to we will fix or solve or cure. When you say we're going to fix this or we're going to solve this, you're painting yourself into a corner. You're making a promise that you can solve this or fix this. use language that is, is more political in nature, like we will, these policies will improve or will enhance. And generally you want to avoid adverbs and superlatives. So try to avoid, things like too much or extremely or the most or the least or horrible or worst or best. Use softer language because that's the language that's spoken by the policymakers to each other and to their constituents. And so that's the kind of language that you want to use. And we are running low on time. That was my last slide. So what I want to do now, I'm sorry I wasn't able to leave more time, but I'm going to unshare my slides. And in the remaining time, I would like to open it up. If anybody has any questions, invite you to turn on your video if you want, unmute, ask a question, or throw it in chat, however you want to do it. But yeah, so those are the main points I wanted to make, and I'm happy to take questions if you have them now.
Thank you so much, Jory. That was really fantastic information that I wish I had had years ago, for sure. I really appreciate your time. Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to unmute your microphones at this time, or you can post questions in the chat window.
Or the other thing I'll say is if anybody here has actually had an opportunity to do this and wants to unmute and share their experience, I'm sure others would love to hear about it and could benefit from that as well.
I definitely can attest to some of the emergency type scenarios that you mentioned where you may not end up actually meeting with the congressperson and kind of feeling frustrated that you have a whole speech prepared or something, and then you get there and you don't even have a chance to talk with them, or you're talking with a staffer. I've been in scenarios like that before that can be very frustrating, like you mentioned, but I appreciate the advice that you gave on, how to, the flip side of how to look at those. Yeah. So we do have some questions in chat.
So yeah, I see the question from Brittany is, how do you handle a situation where the policymakers misunderstand your information and credit you? And I think, Brittany, what you're asking, you can feel free to unmute and clarify, but I think what you're saying is if they misunderstand and misrepresent what you said, and then people think that you actually delivered information that you didn't, is that sort of what you're getting at? Okay. You're not going to like the answer, but the bottom line is, if that happens, there's not really a lot you can do at that point, right? I mean, the best thing I would say there is this is the value of having a very well-crafted one-pager, because more than likely what they're going to do if they're going to quote you or repeat something you said is they're going to use that one-pager as a guideline. So I think you can avoid that, or you can increase the likelihood of avoiding that by having a very well-crafted and clearly communicated one-pager. And then it makes it harder for them to misrepresent that information. But the bottom line is, if they misunderstand you and say, I had a scientist, Brittany Vanderwerf, who was in my office, and she said, the sky is orange, you can't really do much about that. I mean, I suppose one thing you could do is if you had active social media, you could tweet out a clarification, but you need to be very careful about how you handle that, because you don't want to look like you're calling out the policy maker or, accusing them of being ignorant or even worse, intentionally misrepresenting what you said. So you need to handle that very carefully. I would say if that happens, reach out to your government relations office and have them help you. And they probably have strategies for dealing with that as well.
There is a question about AI policy, contacts for AI policy. So
yeah, sorry for misspelling.
That's okay. I knew what you meant.
At first I thought you meant contacting Nancy Pelosi, but no. AI policy. So I think if your question is what policymakers would you contact about that? Again, my recommendation would be to talk to your government relations office, because that's one of their big jobs, is to know who to talk to on the Hill or in the State House about specific initiatives. And so, sometimes you want to talk to the person who represents your district, but other times you may be from California, but you want to talk to the senator from Ohio because they're the one that's most involved in that policy. So working with your government relations office is the best way to determine who best to talk to about specific policies.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Very,
Thank you.
very informative.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Have you seen a situation, or what would you recommend in a situation where things might get a little heated, or you can tell that the person that you're trying to compel or advise may completely disagree with you, or may think that you're wrong, or that your science is bad, or something like that?
Yeah, so I haven't personally been in the room when that's happened. I've heard a few stories about that. What I will say from my contacts in our government relations office who do this all the time, because I asked them that same question, is that actually happens a lot less than you might think. And for the simple reason that politicians are very good at being politicians. And so they know how to avoid those situations. They don't want to have a confrontational discussion with you any more than you want that, right? Because they don't want you walking out of there and going back to your institution and telling all your students in your 500 student lecture, I met with this policymaker and they were a jerk, So, so generally what I'm told is that that's a pretty rare thing. If it happens, I mean, it's just, you have to use good old fashioned diplomacy and say, well, I apologize if I misunderstood. Let me try to clarify, hopefully it's the information on my one pager will help clarify, what we know about this, what we think about this. But, if I can help you, if I can help clarify for you, I'm happy to do that. But just, you certainly don't want to go against the science that you were talking about. But you don't want to escalate the confrontation. But I mean, I think the good news there is that overall, this is something that I'm told doesn't happen because policymakers want to avoid that interaction as much as you do. So it might be awkward and a little bit phony, but it rarely escalates into, an out and out, headbutting conflict.
What about combating, you talked a little bit about confirmation bias, but what about combating junk science? Like some people that come out and, they sometimes companies might, for example, hire a scientist and they end up writing a report that's completely contradictory to actual science, but that happens to align very closely with what the company was hoping to find,
Yeah. So I do whole, day-long workshops on that exact topic. And I'll tell you that, it's a really good question now more than ever, because, we're seeing such a rise in that misinformation and disinformation. And again, it's one of those things that there's not a perfect silver bullet answer for this. Behavioral psychologists have studied these interactions, and there are things we know that don't work. So basically telling someone, you're wrong, you're misinformed, the data show this and not that, and directly contradicting them never works, right? What happens, and they've done studies where they show often in those cases, people will double down and will be even more steadfast and more resolute in clinging to the misinformation, because as a sort of almost subconscious reaction to the perceived insult that you're telling them they're ignorant or they're wrong. So you never want to say you're wrong, the data contradict you. What you do want to say is, again, being more diplomatic, I hear what you're saying, but actually, most of the studies that I've seen say this, and so maybe we can talk a little bit more about what you're saying and what I'm saying and see if there's a common ground, or maybe just clarify what was the source of your information, and here's the source of my information. So it's sort of soft pedaling it, but that's kind of all you can really do. But if you flat out tell someone the data say you're wrong, maybe a politician will be a little more diplomatic about it, but in general that solution doesn't work. So you want to avoid that sort of, throwing the statistics and the facts in their face, but rather looking for common ground, listening to them, giving them an opportunity to clarify what they mean and where they're coming from and where they're getting that information, and then just presenting what based on scientific fact, and then hoping that they'll see through some of the misinformation.
Cool, thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments for Jory? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. And thank you, Jory, for the information. This recording will be made available. And if anybody wants to get in contact with Jory, please let me know. And please take a moment to check the chat window and fill out the short evaluation form about this offering.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks to all of you for attending. And I'm happy to take, individual emails if you have questions. So Jennifer can get my contact info. But thanks everyone for coming. And thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.